So, let me ask you a question. Have you ever looked down at your watch and seen Swiss made on the dial and felt a little more confident about that most recent watch purchase? You're like, okay, I did it right. Now here's the uncomfortable question. What if that label doesn't actually mean what you think it means? And more importantly, what if understanding that actually makes you a more satisfied collector, not a more anxious one? So today, we're not just going to break down what Swiss made means. We're going to go a little bit deeper than that. We're going to talk about who actually makes their watches, who's assembling them, what in-house actually means. And by the end of this podcast, the goal is simple, which is you should feel more confident in your collection, not less. So thanks for joining me today. My name is James. I am a watch collector. I'm an enthusiast and an advisor. And my goal for you is that you know and love your watches. So if you enjoy this type of content, please do like the video, subscribe to the channel. I make new videos every week. And let's dive into this topic. So we're going to start with the facts about Swiss made. So for a watch to say Swiss made on it, it has to meet a few different requirements. Okay, so the first one is the movement itself has to be Swiss. That's the first one. The second one is the watch itself has to be assembled in Switzerland. So you can't have it somewhere else. It's got to be assembled there as well. There also has to be a final inspection of some sort that happens also in Switzerland. So that's another key piece of this. And then at least 60% of the production cost also has to be Swiss. So here's the key point with this though. That 60% is based on the total cost of the watch, not on the components that are in the watch. So it doesn't mean that 60% of the total number of components are made in Switzerland. It's just 60% of the cost of everything in it is Swiss. So this is where collectors can go one of two ways with this. They either feel disappointed because of the fact that they think they've been lied to and their so-called Swiss-made watches are not actually Swiss-made, or they realize something that I think is actually kind of important, which is this is just business, y'all. Like, this is how the industry just works. Not at the affordable level, but all the way up to the top. So you can find inexpensive watches that are part of this. You can also find very high-end watches that are part of this. So that's important to keep in mind about why this really shouldn't bother you all that much. Unless you're like a watch purist and you're like, I have to have the thing from this spot. And honestly, if that's how you feel, my first question to you would be is why? Like, why do you need that? I don't really know why anyone needs that. Most of us don't really care where the things that we get are made. I know there's some, if you're in the U.S., there's maybe a little bit of like, it was made in the U.S. and not China. I get that. But when it comes to watches, what you're getting is quality, is my point. It's not a matter of, well, this part was made in, Switzerland and this part was made somewhere else. Who cares would be my question to you. So the Swiss watch industry itself, it's not built on every brand doing everything. Like any other type of company, it's built on specializing. So you have various types of companies here. You have companies that supply movements that really just make movements. Like ETA, for instance, ETA, they're a great example. They have tons of different calibers. They supply them to a whole bunch of different watches. Solita, there's many, many others. Dial specialists, there are companies that just make dials. Whether it's like just the process of, like coloring them or texturing them or engraving them. I mean, there's all sorts of different companies. Like Carrie Voudelainen is they have their own atelier where they actually do all the engraving and things like that on dials. So like there are companies that just specialize in dials. There are case manufacturers. So there are companies that just do cases. And this is not like, Rolex, that we're going to talk about later, where they make their own cases, but they just make cases and then they send them to other companies to put their movements in or or there's, établisseurs, right? With like Laurent Ferrier is one of the more well-known high-end établisseurs that basically just assemble parts. And there are a lot of companies that before becoming totally vertically integrated became popular and became kind of more, not expected, but a little bit more on the marketing end of things of we make everything in-house. Vacheron Constantin was the same thing. So there's a lot of companies that have done this for a long time that we know well today. And then there are also regulating component experts. So like, making sure that the movements are tested properly, those types of things. There are companies that just do that. And one of the biggest choke points historically is the hairspring itself. So this now is dominated by companies like Niverox, and there are, of course, again, companies that make these all in-house. So that even brands that market themselves as in-house are very often part of a larger ecosystem in the world of watches. So here's the shift that I think is important to make as a collector, and that is instead of asking, is this made fully in-house, ask the same question that I kind of posed to you at the start of this section, which is how much does that actually matter to me, and why does it matter to me? Like if you take pride in having a watch that's made all from Germany or all from Japan or wherever it is, how much does that matter and why does that matter? So what we're going to do is we're going to break the industry up into tiers a little bit, but with a slightly different lens here. So we're not going to talk about just better or worse, because again, I don't think it's a matter of that in terms of quality. Once you get to a certain price point, you really are not in that conversation anymore. You might say more hand finishing, less hand finishing. There's different things like that you'll get more or less of, but not better or worse. It's just the companies take a different approach to their watchmaking, and that's very normal because that's every company ever in any industry. So we have several different kind of tiers of here. First tier are going to be fully integrated brands, and we're going to talk about a couple of these. Rolex is one of them, of course. JLC is one of them. They're fully integrated, right? Then you have companies that are highly integrated. And again, we're going to look at examples of all these. You have companies that are kind of a hybrid of both. You have companies that are assemblers, or again, établisseurs, as we call them. So I mentioned Laurent Ferrier. There are others. And then there are micro brands, that are really just kind of like everything from a Kickstarter to just a solopreneur type of setup, and that's a micro brand. So there are those 5 kind of tiers within the industry. And again, here's the key idea is there's no correct tier for you to collect from. Like there really is not. The only thing that matters is that you value whatever you're collecting from. So, and this is a big mistake that I see people make is, they love Rolex and JLC and big group brands, and then they're like, but I feel like I should own a micro brand. And again, my question to you is why do you think you should do that? Or in the reverse, where it's like I have a bunch of independents and it's like, yeah, but I don't have a Rolex in my collection. And it's the same question. Who cares? Who cares? If you like having the relationship with the brand and getting to know the people and those sorts of things, that's going to lend itself to you wanting to collect certain brands. If you're just like, hey, I just want to know that there's a good company that's got some history to it and that's reputable behind the watch that I'm buying, then buy those. There's not a right or wrong here, and I certainly have both in my collection, even though it probably trends towards, the second of that. I have a lot more, larger group brand watches than, the one independent that I have being my Dan Royter. So let's talk about tier 1, what you're actually paying for here when you buy from these brands. We got to talk about Rolex because Rolex is still the industry leader in this respect. With Rolex, you're paying for control. They make their own metals. They make their own movements. They make their own hairsprings. So they have foundries, where they make their own metals like Rolesor, these kind of fancy terms they come up with to name like a stainless steel and a white gold combination. but they make all their own stuff. Even their steel, right? They promote it as 904L steel. It's more corrosion resistant. So there are benefits to some of these products because they have refined them so much. And everything with Rolex is engineered for consistency's sake. Like that is the whole point of Rolex. It's not about the artistry in the traditional watchmaking sense, even though it's kind of been interesting to see what they're doing with like the new 1908s and doing a couple of pieces with a see-through case back now because you can appreciate the artistry a little bit more. But we know that those are made by machines. Like there's no hand finishing going on at Rolex. So it's not artistry in the traditional sense, but it's more about predictability and reliability at scale. Like that is their game. And if that is what satisfies you as a collector, then Rolex makes a lot of sense. I got one sitting over here. I like it. I like the reliability. My Sky Dweller, right? I love that watch. And I've talked about it before. I think people hate on Rolex a little bit for not being innovative. Not the Sky Dweller, not the Yachtmaster 2, not with some of the metals that they've created, right? So they do some innovative things. We just don't think of them as being innovative because they move so slow with everything that they do. But again, I like it. I don't want to ever get rid of that watch. It was my first watch. I have a lot of ties to it, but it also works really well for me in my lifestyle, in how I use it. It just makes a whole lot of sense. So now let's compare that to a brand like JLC, Jaeger LeCoultre, one of my absolute favorite brands out there, because they do really focus on that artistry, and they really have the emphasis on showcasing their capabilities. This is what I feel like some brands have gone to now, right? I think Vacheron is in a similar boat, as Jaeger LeCoultre, because they're really about, we're gonna make our moon phase watches, we're gonna make our simple time and date watches, we're gonna make our Polaris models, our simple sports watches, all those things. We gotta have that because people want those things. And then we're gonna go crazy and we're gonna show you a Hybris Mechanica that has a guilloche dial on it and a Sphero tourbillon and a minute repeater, which I love that Westminster. It was 2019 release. I think it was one of their best model year releases. That stuff is all about showcasing their capability and what they can do. Even the Master Ultra Thin Perpetual Enamel that I have, same kind of thing. It's not, I'm not like, I didn't want it because I needed a perpetual calendar. It's cool to have a perpetual calendar. I like having it. It's my kind of the high complication in my collection. But that's not why I got it. I got it because of the incredible guilloche work and the enamel work that go into the dial, that it takes 2 to 3 days to make an individual dial. That is spectacular to me. I mean, they have hundreds of calibers. I've seen videos, and pictures of like where they have all the old calibers, like the old Reverso calibers, all those things. Pretty incredible stuff. Deep complication expertise, like I already kind of said. They continue to showcase like the new Helio tourbillon this year in the Duomet with a perpetual calendar and a tri-axis tourbillon. Like that's the kind of stuff that just blows me away. And that's one of the reasons why I like JLC. It appeals to a very different type of collector, which is someone who kind of values watchmaking as more of an art and a discipline. And they kind of mesh those two things together to create not only beautiful design language, but also to incorporate some fantastic artistry into those pieces when they make them. So Rolex, JLC. Next we're going to depart from Swiss for a second, and I'm wearing mine today. Then there is Grand Seiko. And this is where things get interesting because they make almost everything themselves. From mechanical watches to quartz watches. Their innovation with spring drive has been incredible, and seeing that all come to fruition. Even their hair springs, I mean, there's so much that they make. They even grow their own quartz crystals. Like, that is insane to me, because they're using them in so many of their watches. Pretty impressive. So if your definition of satisfaction when it comes to collecting is, I want to know exactly who made this watch, and it's very clear, and we can point to the studio that it came from, like they have their micro artist studio And they have their Shizukuishi studio. Like, they just have so many different studios that they're known for. It's like these watches come from this particular studio, and it was made by, one watchmaker or whatever it is. Grand Seiko does deliver that clarity in a way that I think very few brands do, and that is one of the reasons why I love Grand Seiko. I wanted to have one in the collection, not just because of all the nature-inspired designs and dials and things that they do and how much heritage there is around that, but it's also because of the technology, and I mean that word intentionally because there is technology in a spring drive 5-day movement that is accurate to 15 seconds a month. And now with the UFA, 15 to 30 seconds a year, I think, is what they're rated. So, like, just absolutely incredible. So that's Grand Seiko. Now, that's kind of like, your premier tier of watchmaking. And, of course, there are others, that really exceed that within the Swiss realm. But so now we're going to go to tier 2, which is kind of the smart middle ground of this. And this is where you can kind of find, like, a good level of value here. I think that's important to find value in watchmaking, and I've talked about this a lot before, not only with Grand Seiko, but the other brand that I find has some of the best value is definitely Omega. And Omega is a great balance, or a great example of balance, because they use in-house movements. They've got some real innovation with the tri-level coaxial escapement, that George Daniels is kind of famous for coming up with. But it's also supported by a larger ecosystem. Again, they're part of a group. You have other companies that they can borrow technologies from to use in their watches. Their METAS certification, like all those things, master chronometer status, those types of things. You're getting high-level engineering, which they continue to be some of the most accurate watches, mechanical watches that I've ever owned. But you're not paying for that total vertical independence like you might with some other brands. So I do think that Omega is a smart place to play in the luxury watch space. Then you have another one, and I'm picking my favorites here, guys. You know that I have very much appreciation for these brands. That's why I'm talking about them. Then you have Girard Perregaux, and Girard Perregaux is kind of a hidden gem. And I've talked about this before where, like, I had heard of Girard Perregaux, but everything that people would talk about when Girard Perregaux would come up was, oh, it's the Laureato. Oh, you got to have a Laureato. Like, it just didn't appeal to me because I was very much like, I like my Rolex steel integrated sports watch. I like my Grand Seiko Evolution 9 watch on a bracelet. Like, that was much more where I was at with bracelet watches. So I didn't really have any reason to look into GP because I just didn't think that I needed anything like that in my collection because I already had it. But then when you look into it a little bit and you realize, okay, these guys are really doing some amazing stuff here. They've had multiple calibers that they have released this year that have been brand new, in-house, and they've put the work into these movements. They're beautiful. And they look good. The engineering is obviously very intentional. So they really have some capability in-house. Like, there's no doubt about that. The 3 Bridges concept watches that they've come out with, the minute repeater, like, they have really done some incredible stuff here. Or not minute repeater, the, constant force escapement. That's what I was thinking. So yeah, GP, real in-house capability, strong credibility too as a horological brand. Like, there's no one that would look at GP and say, like, well, but they're just XYZ, or they don't have a history, or, they don't have the innovation that other brands. It's like they have all those things. They're just way less hyped than a lot of these other brands. I almost view Girard Perregaux as like if JLC did no marketing, I feel like it would be kind of Girard Perregaux. And maybe if their prices were a little bit lower, But I don't know. GP is up there in terms of pricing too, so maybe not even that. But yeah, it's almost like if JLC just was kind of like under the radar. I feel like it would be Girard Perregaux almost, and they just have a different brand identity, different things that they bring to it, because you just don't have the same level of hype around Girard Perregaux as you have with a lot of these other brands. And for a lot of collectors today, that's actually part of the appeal, since so much emphasis, and even from my perspective, right? Like I do place emphasis on you gotta avoid the hype. Like you're not immune to it. No one is immune to it in this space because it's everywhere. But some people kind of take that as a part of the appeal of the brand. It's like, oh, it's kind of a sleeping giant. You know, nobody really knows about Girard Perregaux. It's not just the Laureato. It's the 1966 Orion, you know, and all these other crazy watches that they've been making. So I do really like that about Girard Perregaux. I just think it's great. So now let's shift to a different place. We've been talking about Swiss watchmaking. Let's step outside of Switzerland because I do think, you know, again, you don't need to collect from everywhere. You can collect from where you want to collect from, but I do think that if you want to feel grounded in terms of your collection, at least knowing about some of these brands, German watchmaking offers a very, very different perspective. So we've talked about Swiss made, we've talked about Japan with Grand Seiko, and of course, you know, Seiko all the way up, Grand Seiko and Crador at the top. And now we're talking about German watchmaking because you have a very different perspective and very different approach that you see in these brands. So I cannot have this conversation about German watchmaking without talking about Lange und Söhne. And I've talked about them before. Lange is all about intention. Very intentional with what they do, what they make, even how they advertise, you know, like just seeing just the way that they market their brand. Very intentional. So with Lange, you have much lower production than any of the prior brands that I mentioned there. The finishing is exquisite. Like it's probably up there. I mean, I had a video where I talked about my last podcast actually, where I talked about the 5 different watches that have some of the best finishing in watchmaking, and one of those, of course, is a Lange und Söhne because their finishing is just spectacular. Every detail is deliberate. Everything is planned. Everything is done by hand, including the balance bridge that is hand engraved every single time on their watches. So Lange to me is someone who wants to, you know, in collecting values, depth over volume. Like you want to go deep down the artistry and quality rabbit hole, and it doesn't matter how many they're making. That's what they do. Like that is what they do. I think Jorn is another one, obviously not necessarily German, but Jorn is another brand that comes to mind when I think about things like this. And then you have some other German brands too, I think that deserve mentioning, right? I mean, Glashütte Original, really, really great stuff as well. I at first, honestly, when I saw GO, I thought it was Lange, just because it has the same kind of vibe to it, the same kind of design style, but they are their own brand, you know. Even things like dial production for GO are done in-house, and I think they're definitely worth looking at. I think Lange is definitely up there in terms of the price segment. GO is right within the rest of the brands that we mentioned, you know, right around that kind of JLC, pricing. So if you are into German watchmaking and you don't have the budget for Lange, I do think that GO is definitely a place you could look, and there's great value in GO. I don't own one yet, but definitely I would not rule them out because I've seen some really incredible stuff, in the metal from them. So, again, it's rare and meaningful if you care about that level of control to have your dial production done in-house. So that's just an example of like how much they care about that. Nomos, I have not really looked at Nomos a lot. I don't talk about Nomos too much because I have not really dug into the brand. But I do know, especially like as a collector story, basically they started out with outsourced movements and then they slowly worked their way into true in-house production. And that, to me, is a testament to the care and the quality that Nomos is dedicated to. That's a cool progression to have because it shows that, value and integrity of the brand are not tied to price alone. Because, again, with Nomos Glashütte, you're getting, watches that are at a much more reasonable price point, typically anywhere from, I think, like $2,000 to $3,000 range is somewhere abouts. And I'm sure there's some that are even less than that. So So ultimately, when it comes to German watchmaking, it tends to feel more focused, it tends to feel more intentional, tends to feel less driven by the scale of what's out there. And for many collectors, that actually creates its own different kind of satisfaction. And I think that's pretty cool. So, cheers to German watchmaking. There's some really amazing stuff going on, particularly with those brands that I mentioned. Now, let's talk a little bit about independence and what they really offer. So we've touched on Swiss, we've touched on Japanese, we've touched on German. Now we got to go independent. So what do they really offer? And I do think that independence offers something else entirely. And the brand that comes to mind close to home for me here is Dan Royter, because of course I have a Dan Royter and have developed a relationship with Dan over the last several years. And he's just an amazing guy all around. He understood my plight as I was wanting this watch, and then went through some health challenges and came out the other side okay. And so there's a lot of a personal story with Dan that you just don't have with, I have no personal story about my JLC. As much as I love it, and I have a personal relationship with the person who I bought it from, but I don't have a personal relationship with the watchmaker who made my beautiful JLC watch. With Dan, I do have a relationship, and there is a little bit of a connection there, because that's what you get with independence, is something else entirely. So smaller production, obviously. It's very often one person, sometimes it's a small group of people. More direct involvement. So Dan in particular, right, he does bespoke watchmaking, and this is like your Sartori Biards and your Garricks, from what I understand. They do a lot of very custom work, whether it's dial or engraving or just different things like that. You definitely have a clearer story behind the watch. Like I mentioned with Dan, I first wanted one of these watches, prior to some health challenges that I went through, put in my intention, said, hey, let's go. And then I found out that I, was diagnosed with cancer at the time. It wasn't a great time, but I was like, you know what, I'm not going to be able to do this. I've got all these medical expenses coming in, and that was the pause point. And it was like, cool, yeah, sounds good. Let me know if you, end up still wanting this. And then a few months later, everything worked out very well for me. And so I was like, I'm ready, let's do it. And he was like, gotcha. And it took probably, I don't know, maybe 2 months. And then I had my watch. So pretty awesome story. But even here, when you talk about the independents, they're not making every component. And again, that's okay. They're often importing everything. They're getting a movement, they're getting a case, they're getting, in Dan's case, he even has a specific manufacturer that he works with for the straps. They make these incredible leather straps that are just really thick and beefy and vibrant colors and just really, really nice. And that's okay. I'm good with that, because what I'm buying in that instance is not total vertical integration, but I'm buying the authorship of the watch. In this case, it was a group watch. Shout out to Tim Masso out there. This was a group watch that Dan did for our group, and they allowed some customization. Normally Dan customizes it even more, but it was the authorship of it. It was I get to tailor and be a part of the journey of the watch being built, and also then getting the watch, and that is what I'm paying for, which is pretty awesome. You don't get to do that with a Rolex or a JLC. Now, let's talk about the lower tiers. Again, not worse watchmakers, just lower tiers on that scale, right? And let's be honest about this. Some of these are probably the most satisfying watches to own in this category. And I don't have any really from this category, but I did, I'll mention, one or two. So you have hybrid brands, assemblers, and micro brands. So again, I think of a brand like Laurent Ferrier, one of the most incredible assemblers that's out there. And when you do it at that level, Laurent is probably in the, Patek, Lange, in terms of value and price point. They're not cheap watches by any means. But they make some very beautiful designs. They make some very interesting, they have a dial that literally looks like a map. of the world, and there's enameling that creates like the backdrop with like those heat maps where they show like where there's lights and activity, across like a global map. It's literally that made with enamel. I mean, it's pretty cool. And they do some incredible stuff there. And why? Why are they underrated in my opinion? Because they focus on the design, they focus on the wearability, and they focus on the value of the watch that you're getting. And they use proven movements that are easy to service. In Laurent's case, I don't even know where their movements are from, but I know just looking at them, they have some very, very visually appealing movements, if nothing else. So basically with those types of brands, instead of chasing in-house, you get the peace of mind that like you were not going to have any issue getting your watch serviced, that you're going to get the support that you need. It's going to be unique. There's not a lot of people with those out there. Like the number of people who own a Laurent Perrier versus the number of people who want or own a Rolex is like this. I mean, it's just astronomically different. So that's another piece of the value that you get with those types of brands. So we've talked about a lot. We've talked about Swiss made, kind of debunked the myth a little bit. And honestly, let's bring this down to earth and bring it back to you, because that is what this channel is all about. It's about you knowing and loving your watches. It's not about chasing specs. It's not about chasing status, but it's about building a collection that you actually enjoy. And y'all have seen my collection. I've shared it in podcasts and talked about it. I talked about it multiple times. And I love my collection. I would not change a single thing about my collection. Yes, we have limited resources, and sometimes we have to make decisions that we, may feel good about afterwards or not. But I think if you're doing it for the right reasons, you're going to enjoy it. So vertical integration, does it matter? It matters if it matters to you, but it's not a requirement to have a great watch, not by any means. And it's definitely not a requirement for a satisfying collection. I have 6 watches, and I love all of them equally. I wouldn't trade any of them. I wouldn't sell any of them. Again, there's been moments and periods where I've thought about like, okay, I could go after a certain watch, but it's at a higher price point, so then I'd have to trade in a few, and I have done that. But I don't not like any of the watches that I have, and I'm super satisfied with the collection that I have. So next time you look at Swiss made on your dial, don't ask the question, is this enough? Is this right? Instead, ask the question, is this enough for me? Is this right for me? Because once you answer that question honestly, you can stop chasing whatever that next hype watch is, and you can start enjoying what you already have. Because that is the whole point of what this channel is about. So, if this helped you think differently about your collection, please do subscribe. Please like the video. This channel is all about building a collection that you don't feel that need to constantly upgrade or constantly, make a move or trade something, or like that's not what it's about. So I just want to say thank you for taking the time to stop by the video. I really appreciate it. And, leave a comment down below. What are you feeling in your collection right now? Is there anything that you're thinking that you're wanting to move, that you're wanting to change? And what does that look like? Let me know in the comments down below. Thanks for being here, and I will catch you on the next podcast. Take care. Bye-bye.